In this chapter, we're going to cover the tools of a government stability policy in terms of aggregated demand, AD, and aggregated supply, AS model. We're going to examine the financial or the fiscal policy measure that adjusts government expenditure and tax revenue when the economy moves throughout the business cycle phases. Okay, we'll discuss the material on public debt and review the force concern associated with a large public debt. One of them is the debt will force U.S. government into bankruptcy, right? Second one you hear is that the debt will impose a burden on future generation. We will clarify those two concerns. And also throughout the chapter, we will review also the potential problem of a large public debt, including a possibility of larger or greater income inequality, reduce economic incentive, crowding out of private investment. Okay, so here are the concepts to cover: fiscal policy and aggregated demand, aggregated supply model, built-in stability tools, evaluating how expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy is determined, a recent and projected U.S. policy, fiscal policy, problems, criticism, and complication of implementing fiscal policy. And we will conclude with U.S. public debt. So fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy refers to the deliberate manipulation of taxes and government spending by Congress. And why they do that is the manipulation is designed to alter real domestic output, right? To ensure full employment, control inflation, right? Stimulate economic growth, right? A discretionary means that there's a purposely changes, right, that are made to the regulation so that government can achieve those objectives by changing tax code or changing the government spending in the economy, right, to be able to achieve full employment, control inflation, and promote economic growth. And the discretionary fiscal policy are often initiated by the president on the advice of the Council of Economic Advisor, the CEA. And when the government or the president initiated, it will go to the policymaker for approval. So expansionary fiscal policy is used to combat recession when the economy is recessive, where the output produce decrease and the economy is in recession, the unemployment rate is high, government will kick in expansionary fiscal policy. And this will increase government spending, decrease taxes, or combine both policy. You can use both two at the same time. And when using the tool of expansionary fiscal policy, government will add to the deficit. It will add a deficit to the budget, right? The deficit will increase. So these figure illustrate expansionary fiscal policy. So they increase government spending, cut taxes to push the economy out of a recession. Right? In economy with a marginal propensity of 0.75, as what we alluded to in the previous chapter, a 5 billion increase in government spending, or a 6.67 billion decrease in government taxes, right, will expand the economy from AD, right, AD2 to this discontinued curve, right, and the multiplier will push it all the way to AD1. And doing so, it will close this recessionary GDP gap that we have over here, right? So the recessionary GDP gap being the 20 billion, and if government initiate a 5 billion additional spending, and here in our example, the multiplier being 4, the first push, the 5 billion will push the aggregated demand AD2, right, to this discontinued curve, and the multiplier going to magnify this initial investment, push it all the way to AD1, closing the recessionary GDP gap that we have. So now that we review, we know what is expansionary fiscal policy. Let's look at contractionary fiscal policy. Right? When the economy experiences demand pull inflation, contractionary fiscal policy is the tools to use. Right? The problem with inflation is that aggregated demand is too high. So the government will want to use the tool to decrease government spending, or increase taxes, right, to cause the aggregated demand to fall. So when government use contractionary fiscal policy, it will create a surplus. Okay, so we're going to look at this illustration of a contractionary fiscal policy. So the contractionary fiscal policy decrease government spending, increase in taxes, or do both to reduce demand pull inflation. Here, an increase in aggregated demand from AD3, right, to AD4 has driven the economy from point A to point B. And at the same time, if you look at the price level, it also ratcheted the price level to P2, causing inflation. Right. And once the price level, we say before, is ratcheted higher, it becomes inflexible downward. So if we keep the same assumption of marginal propensity to consume of 0.75 and the multiplier being 4, government can either reduce the spending by 3 billion or increase taxes by 4 billion. Right, because here the inflationary gap to close here is 12 billion. So when government reduce or decrease the spending by 3 billion, what will happen is the aggregate demand AD4, it will push it to the discontinued line, and the multiplier will push it all the way to the position that is supposed to be, which is C. And you see here that it doesn't push it all the way to the initial position due to the fact that the ratchet concept of the price that we alluded to before, and that makes the price inflexible downward. So aggregated demand here will shift leftward. First, it will shift from AD4 to the dashed downward sloping curve to the left, and then we shift all the way to AD5 with the price remaining at P2. So the economy will move from B to C, and the gap, the inflationary gap of 12 billion will disappear. Built-in stability. A concept arises because net taxes change with GDP. Right. It's desirable for spending to rise when the economy is sloping, and vice versa. When the economy is becoming inflationary, automatic stability, it reduces instability, whereby it does not eliminate economic instability. It reduces instability, but does not eliminate economic instability. So that's revenue. That's what we saw before, vary directly with GDP, income, sales, excise, payroll, taxes, all increase when the economy is expanding. When we experience growth, all those also gonna increase, and they all gonna decrease when the economy is contracting. Transfer payment, like unemployment, compensation, welfare payment, vary indirectly with economic business cycle. When the economy is expanding, people tend to collect less of those transfers. But if the economy is contracting, that's why people are out of work. Automatically, people ask for more unemployment benefit. The size of the automatic stability depend on the responsiveness of changes in tax to changes in GDP. The more progressive the tax system, the greater the economy built in stability. So a progressive tax system mean that the average tax rate rises with a GDP, right? So a proportional tax system mean that the average tax rate remain constant as a GDP rises or fall. And the regressive tax system mean that the average tax rate falls as GDP rises. But one thing to keep in mind here, tax revenues will rise with GDP and above progressive and proportional tax system. And they may fall, rise, or stay the same under a regressive tax system. So this figure illustrates built-in stability. You see here that our tax curve, right, vary directly with the GDP. As the GDP increases, the tax also increases. And government spending here, the G, is assumed to be independent of GDP. Right, so here as GDP fall into recession, as GDP fall into recession, deficit will happen, right? And this is automatic, right? There's nothing need to be done. It's an automatic process. As GDP fall, now you see that we collect less tax revenue compared to the government spending. So that will generate deficit. But as a GDP increases, right, the tax revenue. And in our blue area here, you see that the tax revenue collected is greater than government spending. And ultimately, this will generate a surplus to the budget. How we evaluate fiscal policy, how we know that government is putting forward expansionary fiscal policy, neutral fiscal policy, or contractionary fiscal policy. Okay. We use cyclically adjusted budget to evaluate fiscal policy. Right. Another name for the cyclically adjusted budget is the full employment budget. And this full employment budget assesses what the federal budget deficit or surpluses will be with existing taxes and government spending if the economy is at full employment. So fiscal policy is neutral when the tax revenues is equal to government expenditure after adjusting for the reduction in revenue from a recession. Right? Cyclically adjusted budget deficit is zero in 1 year and also will remain zero. So you know that there's no change to the budget. So it'll be the same in the first year and the second year. Fiscal policy is expansionary when the cyclically adjusted budget is zero in year 1, and there's a deficit in the next year. So you know that government wants more money to be able to push the economy out of recession, which is expansionary fiscal policy. And the fiscal policy is contractionary when the cyclically adjusted budget deficit is zero in 1 year and followed by cyclically adjusted budget surplus in the next year. So the next graph gonna illustrate the concept better. So, and this graph looks similar to what we saw before. In this graph, you have again the tax line and also the government spending. And this figure shows the cyclically adjusted deficit, right? So what happened here in year 1 when we are full employment, for instance, we are here, right? We balance the budget because our tax revenue is equal to the spending at G, right? So if a business cycle here, right, this is a full employment. But if there's a business cycle with a GDP2, what happened here is it remains zero because there's no changes to the tax code or to this government spending. It remains the same and the tax is still the same. Right. So here our spending is 5 billion, right? And the revenue, again, is the revenue collected when we are, the tax collected when we are of full employment. So the government spending of 5 billion here is also equal to 5 billion of tax revenue, right? That will be collected at full employment and GDP 1. So 5 billion equal to 5 billion, right? So there's no change to fiscal policy, which is a neutral. So if we look at this graph, it shows you cyclically adjusted deficit, right? Discretionary fiscal policy. So you'll see here that there's a change in the tax line, right? So as reflected here by a downshift of the tax line from T1 to T2, right? And doing that, that has increased this cyclically adjusted budget deficit from 0 in year 3 and now to 25 billion in year 4, right, after tax cut. So originally we are here, our tax line, right, for employment. And now that there's a discretionary action being taken to reduce the tax code, and that should show here by a shift downward of the tax line from TY to T2, that bring it down, right? As the economy recesses, right, the spending that we have is still 5 billion, right? But if you bring it back to the tax that the government will collect a full employment and a new tax code, T2, you see that it's less, 25 billion less, which is 5 billion originally minus 475 give you that 25 billion, which is a less revenue collected. So since the spending is greater by 25 billion, that 25 billion will add to the deficit. This table provided by the Congressional Budget Office show you the projection of a deficit and debt from 2018 all the way to 2028. Right. So show you the actual deficit and the cyclically adjusted deficit. Here you will realize that the actual deficit is greater than the cyclically adjusted deficit or surplus. Why? Because the actual deficit or surplus already include the cyclically adjusted deficit or surplus. During the early 2000, the economy experienced severe period of a brief recession, and Congress responded by passing 2 different car tax law in effort to stimulate the economy. These tax cuts serve to increase the cyclically adjusted budget deficit. In year 2008, Congress passed an economic stimulus package of 152 billion, right, consisting of a check to taxpayer, veteran, Social Security recipient, and some tax break for business. This package didn't work to stimulate the economy as a whole. So in 2000, a year later, in 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was enacted and consists of 787 billion of tax rebate and large amount of government spending. This came in after a government spent 700 billion for financial institution in what we call the TARP, right? Wanted to point out here, although a recession officially ended in summer of 2009, the economy was slow to recover, right? Leading the government to continue their policy of fiscal stimulus, right? That add more to the budget deficit, to the point that many economists argue that continue with the policy may lead to inflation. If a government keep that fiscal stimulus policy, may end up, instead of correcting, push the economy out of recession, it may end up creating inflation, which is bad as a recession. Yeah, some of the problem, criticism, and the complication of fiscal policy. We have recognition lag is the time between the beginning of a recession or inflation and awareness of it. And the lag between the time the need for fiscal policy is recognized. And the time action is taken is referred to administrative lag. So the challenge here is, even though you have the problem, it will take you time to recognize the problem, officially recognize the problem. And even though you recognize the problem, there's also time to take action, which is administrative lag, right? And operation lag is another challenge here, which is the time between the change in policy and the impact in the economy. You change the policy, it won't impact the economy right away. It will take time to impact the economy, right? And on the top of all this timing problem, there's also some political consideration, right? A political business cycle made this destabilize the economy as well, right? Election period, right? Election year, right, have been cut. We see a lot of things in election year, right? So election year is, you see more expansionary policy, unnecessary expansionary policy, regardless of economic condition, especially when the politician want to hang on to the office. They want to stay in the office. They will take action regardless of the economic condition. And the action they usually take is they go toward expansionary policy. Right. So household also may believe that the tax break or the tax break that they are enjoying today is temporary, and consequently they want to save more money than spending those money. because they probably anticipate that if a new politician comes to the office, they may reverse the existing policy. Right. You have also offsetting state and local finance. Right. The state and local finance policy may offset federal stabilization policy. Right. You receive a tax break from federal. In the same token, your state or local government increase taxes, so you cannot spend it. You receive tax break, and you have to pay more taxes. In the other hand, we have also the crowding out effect. Right, the crowding out effect happened with government deficit spending. Right, it may increase interest rate on the investment market, and consequently, it will reduce the private spending, because private business won't be able to compete with the government in the investment market. So that will reduce private spending, which eventually will cancel the stimulus of the fiscal policy. U.S. public debt. So the national public debt is those accumulation of the federal total deficit and surpluses that have been occurred throughout time. And usually it's a result of war financing, right? Lack of political will to reduce them. And to get some idea, in 2006, prior to a recession, the public debt was about 8.5 trillion. And then a double to 18.2 in 2015. And since then, it has grown. In 2019, it was about 22.1 trillion. So who US own the money to? Right. They owe it to the holder of a US security. And US security are treasury bills, right? Treasury bills are the short-term security. And we have treasury note, medium-term security, and the long-term security are treasury bound. We also have a US saving bond, or the long-term non-marketable security. So anyone who holds this security, right, you are the owner of the US public debt, and you are entitled to interest. So these figures show the ownership of the total US public debt in 2018. This graph shows the federal debt held by public, right, excluding the Federal Reserve as a percentage of GDP from year 1970 to 2018. This global perspective, right, it show you the higher public debt, right? So here, US, if you look at it in absolute term, have a higher public debt. But if you look at it as a percentage of a GDP, you see that US is here compared to other nations, right? So on the ratio to GDP in 2017, you see that US is relatively better, right, if you compare it to other nations. The concern on higher public debt. So interest charge are the main burden imposed by debt because government is obligated to pay at least interest on their debt. Why they had to do that? They had to pay those interests when they are due to remain in good credit standing. Can federal government, go bankrupt? There are reasons why they cannot, right? Government can they have that coercive power to raise taxes. Government can raise taxes to pay back the debt. They can borrow more, right, by selling new security to refinance a bond when they are mature. Right? Corporations today use a similar method, right? And they always have outstanding debt. Of course, the refinancing could become an issue with a higher enough debt to GDP ratio. You remember the case of Greece. Greece is running into that problem. A high and a rising ratio. In the United States may generate a fear that the US government might not be able to pay back loan as they can do. However, with the current US debt to GDP ratio, the prospect and also the prospect of long-term economic growth, this is a false concern for the United States to run into bankruptcy. I said before, government have the power to tax which businesses and individuals do not have when they are in debt. Does debt impose a burden on our future generation? Studies show that in 2015, the per capita federal debt in the United States was around $56,368. But the way you look at it, the public debt is also a public credit because people who own those security eventually will earn interest. If your grandparent own one of the security, which a taxpayer are paying interest on it, someday you may inherit those security, right? That will be asset to you, and you'll be entitled to receive those interests. So the true burden of those of the larger public debt is borne by those who pay taxes or loan government money today to finance government spending. Also to keep in mind, if the spending is for a productive purpose, it will enhance the future earning power of the economy, right? And the size of the debt relative to future GDP and the population could actually decline. Some of substantive issues, right, that can happen with the debt. Repayment of the debt affect the income distribution. If a working taxpayer will be paying interest to mainly the wealthier category of people who hold the security, right? This probably will increase the income disparity between the have and the don't have, right? Since the interest must be paid out of government revenue, a large public debt and higher interest can increase the tax burden and also may decrease incentive to work, right? To save, to invest for taxpayer. A higher proportion of the debt is owed to foreign. We saw the graph before, about 31% than in the past. And this can also increase the burden since the payment leave the country to those foreigners. We have to pay them because we own them money due to the fact that they own some of the security, 31% of security. But if you look at it globally, US national also own the bond from foreign country. So the net, right, there's offset over there. If you look at it globally, the effect might not be severe. Some economists believe also that public borrowing cloud out private investment, but the extent of that clouding out is not clear. Okay. The last word of the chapter review the concept of Social Security and Medicare. Social Security is the major public retirement program in the United States. And how we fund Social Security, half of the tax that funds Social Security is paid by individual, 6.2%, and the other half, another 6.2%, paid by employer. Medicare, right, program is the health care program for people age 65 and older in the United States. And how we found it, half 1.45% paid by individual and another 1.45% paid by employer. Right. There is impending long-run shortfall in Social Security funding. Why? Because the program is a pay-as-you-go system. What that means is that the current revenue collected are used to pay current retiree, right? Instead of paying from the fund accumulated from previous year. So despite effort to build a trust fund, eventual Social Security revenue will fall below payout to retirees. Today we see that the baby boomers are in retirement age and live longer, right? Meaning that there are more recipients receiving payout for longer period of time. And the ratio of the number of workers contributing to the system for each recipient has a decline. So those are the challenges that Social Security face, and numerous solutions has been put forward, right? And each has an economic trade-off, right? For instance, reduce benefit by reducing direct payment, taxing benefit received, and or increase the age at which workers are eligible to receive benefit. And that one, I think, is already part of the system. Increase revenue by raising payroll taxes, right? Also increase the trust fund by setting aside more of current system revenue, or by investing trust fund monies in corporate stocks or bond. Additionally, one solution is to allow a worker to invest half of the payroll taxes in approved stock and bond funds. Something referred to as privatizing Social Security. There are many possible solutions, and the political process may well result in a combination of the many policies proposed by economists.